Have you ever lived with someone who seemed strange, but never dangerous, until the day you learned what they were really doing? That question has haunted me ever since the night my uncle came home covered in dirt, his eyes avoiding mine, his hands trembling as he muttered excuses I couldn't understand. For years, I thought he was just an odd man with harmless quirks, a man who collected old maps, vanished for hours on end, and told stories that never quite added up. I never imagined what was really happening beneath the surface. My earliest memory of him is of a quiet presence in the house, someone who kept to himself and rarely joined our family gatherings. He had this habit of slipping out the back door at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, disappearing into the woods behind the house. When he returned, often the soles of his shoes were caked with mud, and his clothes bore scratches from branches. He never talked about where he'd been. When I asked, he'd give vague answers about exploring or checking on something. I didn't press further. I figured he was just a man who liked his solitude. His collection of old maps fascinated me. They covered the walls of his small study, some yellowed with age, others marked with strange symbols and routes I couldn't decipher. He'd occasionally tell me stories about the places on those maps, forgotten towns, old trails, places where history seemed to have disappeared. But the stories never made sense. Details would change each time, or he'd trail off mid-sentence, staring at a point on the map as if recalling something he didn't want to say. I thought it was just an eccentric hobby, something to occupy his mind. Then there was the night that changed everything. I was sitting in the living room when he walked in, dirt smudged across his face and hands, his clothes torn and soaked in sweat. He was breathing hard, his eyes darting around nervously. I asked him where he'd been, but he just mumbled something about losing track of time and needing to check the spot. When I looked at him closely, I realized he was more shaken than I'd ever seen him. He wouldn't meet my gaze. Days later, there was a knock on our door. 2 detectives stood there, holding a folder with photos and notes. They told us about a place deep in the forest, a hidden clearing my uncle had been visiting for years, though none of us knew about it. They said what they found there was disturbing, and it explained a lot about him. I remember feeling my stomach drop as they unfolded a map on the table, pointing to a location that matched one of the old maps on his wall. It was a place we never would have suspected had any significance. That moment shattered everything I thought I knew about my uncle. Every strange habit, every wandering story, every quiet disappearance suddenly took on a terrifying new meaning. The man I thought I understood was hiding something far darker than I ever imagined. And I realized that the truth was a puzzle we couldn't ignore, one that would change our family forever. It's easy to want to turn away when the shadows grow longer and the questions multiply. But trust me, what's coming next will pull you deeper than you expect. The pieces that seemed scattered and confusing start to connect in ways that don't just reveal secrets, they reshape everything we thought was real. So stick with me here, because the story isn't just unfolding, it's about to take a turn that will make you see every detail in a new light. We're stepping into moments where silence speaks louder than words, and every glance carries weight. The house, once a familiar refuge, now feels like a stage for something much bigger, something we all have to face together. You don't want to miss what's waiting just beyond the next door, the subtle signs hiding in plain sight, or the unexpected truths that will challenge everything you thought you knew. This isn't just about uncovering a secret, it's about understanding the cost of keeping it hidden, and how far one family will go to protect or destroy what lies beneath the surface. The journey is just beginning, and the best way through is to stay close, pay attention, and keep your heart open to the twists that haven't revealed themselves yet. There's more waiting to be discovered, and it's going to change everything. My uncle's world always seemed anchored to the past, but not in any ordinary way. His obsession with old maps was the first thing anyone noticed about him. He had a collection that sprawled across the living room table and shelves, faded papers with curled edges, inked coastlines, and hand-drawn rivers that no longer matched any modern cartographer's work. The smell of aged parchment, a mix of dust, ink, and something faintly musty, clung to him like a second skin. He'd spread the maps out for hours, tracing routes with his finger, murmuring place names under his breath, as if trying to summon something from the lines and symbols. But the maps were only part of the story. His moods shifted like the weather here, sudden storms followed by calm skies. One moment, he'd be quietly engrossed, almost serene, and the next, he'd snap at the smallest thing, his voice rising sharp and urgent. Sometimes I thought I saw a flicker of something behind his eyes, restlessness, or maybe something darker. When his temper flared, the air in the room felt heavy, charged, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then just as quickly he'd withdraw, retreating into silence or one of his long walks into the woods behind the house. Those walks were a ritual no one tried to stop. He'd leave without a word, often at odd hours, slipping into the trees like a shadow. The crunch of dry leaves and twigs beneath his boots would fade into a quiet stillness, broken only by distant bird calls or the rustling of branches. I tried following him once, keeping to the edges of the forest, but he vanished among the trunks. The wood seemed to swallow him whole, and when he returned hours later, his face was flushed, his eyes distant. He never said much about where he'd been or what he'd seen. Sometimes, he carried handfuls of moss or strange rocks, which he'd examine with the same intensity as his maps. The family learned to live with his quirks, folding them into the fabric of daily life as if they were just another background noise. His unpredictable moods became just how he is, his solitary walks his way of clearing his head. When he muttered about forgotten trails or hidden places only he could see, we nodded and changed the subject. It was easier to pretend it was harmless eccentricity than to ask the questions that made everyone uneasy. My parents, my cousins, even my siblings treated his behavior like a riddle with no answer, something to be tolerated rather than solved. I wanted to understand him, to bridge the gap between his world and mine. I spent hours with him, watching as his fingers traced the worn edges of maps, listening to his quiet observations about terrain and history. Yet, no matter how close I tried to get, something always felt just out of reach. His eyes held secrets he never shared, and the silence between his words was thicker than the forest he wandered. I asked questions, gentle ones, but he gave only fragments in response, cryptic comments about paths lost to time or places that weren't meant to be found. The harder I looked, the more elusive he became, like a shadow slipping through the cracks of daylight. Then one night, everything shifted. He came home later than usual, his steps hurried and uneven. The familiar scent of earth and pine that clung to him was mixed with something else, an undercurrent of sweat and fear. His hands trembled slightly as he set his pack down by the door, eyes darting toward the windows, as if expecting something or someone. I'd never seen him like that before, nervous, unsettled, a tension radiating from him that made the room feel colder. He sank into the armchair without a word, staring into the dim light as if trying to make sense of something only he could see. The maps lay untouched on the table, their edges curling, waiting. And in that moment, I realized this was no ordinary night. Something had changed, and I wasn't sure we were ready for what was coming. The front door creaked open in the dead silence of the night, and he stepped inside like a shadow slipping through the cracks. The moment he crossed the threshold, the sharp, pungent scent of earth hit me, a thick, damp smell, rich with a deep musk of soil freshly disturbed. It clung to him, soaked into the fabric of his jacket and the worn seams of his pants. Dark smudges of dirt streaked across his sleeves and smattered his shoes, the grime stubbornly embedded as if he'd been crawling through the very guts of the earth. I watched him move slowly down the hallway, the tremor in his hands unmistakable now. His fingers twitched as if trying to shake off some invisible weight, but the quiver only grew more pronounced with each step. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor ahead, deliberately avoiding mine, like he was carrying a secret too heavy to share. When he finally sat down, the chair groaned under his weight, and his shoulders sagged in a way that made my stomach knot with unease. "Rough day outside," he muttered, voice low and strained, breaking the silence but offering nothing more. I wanted to press him, to ask where exactly he'd been, what had left him like this, but the excuse sounded so thin, so fragile. "I was just checking the soil by the ridge," he said, his words tumbling out too quickly, like a weak shield against whatever doubts I was beginning to feel. It was a flimsy story, one that didn't explain the way his eyes darted nervously when I glanced his way, or why his hands trembled as he ran them over his dirt-streaked clothes, as if trying to scrub away the memory of something far worse than mud. Still, I tried to believe him, tried to make sense of it all with logic and reason. Maybe he'd slipped in the field, or maybe there had been a sudden storm that forced him into the dirt. Maybe the old maps he studied had sent him wandering further than usual, caught up in some obscure detail that only he understood. The rationalizations circled in my mind, desperate attempts to fill the growing void of silence between us. But the truth was, the man I thought I knew was fraying at the edges. That night, under the same roof where we'd shared countless quiet evenings, something had shifted. The air between us was heavier, charged with a kind of tension that whispered of secrets better left buried. Hours later, when the house had fallen into deep shadows and the only sound was the slow tick of the old clock on the mantel, I crept down the hall, drawn by a faint glow beneath the study door. Peering inside, I saw him hunched over the desk, his figure outlined by the flickering light of a desk lamp. His hands trembled violently now, the same hands that had been covered in dirt hours before, wielding a pen like a lifeline. With painstaking care, he was redrawing one of his old maps, the same one we'd studied together countless times, each line wavering with a tremor of his grip, each stroke more desperate than the last. His eyes were dark, haunted, and fixed on the paper as if trying to rewrite not just the map, but the course of something much larger, something we hadn't yet dared to understand. And in that moment, watching him alone and trembling in the stillness, I knew that whatever had brought him home covered in dirt was only the beginning. The doorway creaked softly as I slipped inside his room, the faint glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. My eyes immediately found the maps spread out on the cluttered table, their edges curling with age, yet still stubbornly vibrant with ink and symbols. I had seen them before, of course, countless times, but tonight something pulled me closer, a quiet urgency I couldn't explain. Each map was different. Some depicted dense forests, others sprawling mountain ranges, and a few showed towns and rivers I recognized from stories but had never visited. What caught my attention were the markings, circles, arrows, and dates scribbled in messy handwriting that seemed to pulse with significance. The circles were often drawn in red, sometimes thick and deliberate, other times shaky as if drawn in haste or fear. Arrows crisscrossed the pages, connecting points that made no obvious sense to me, weaving a complex web I couldn't untangle. There were dates too, some old, faded into the paper like whispers from the past, others fresh and stark against the yellowed parchment. One date kept appearing, scrawled in a hurried script, November 7th, 2024. It was the same day he came home covered in dirt, the night I couldn't stop wondering where he had been. Next to these dates were cryptic notes, phrases like "watch the shadows," "beneath the old oak," and "don't trust the light." The words were unsettling, but more than anything, they made no sense without the man who wrote them. As I traced one arrow leading from a circled point deep in the forest to a cluster of marks near a river, I noticed a symbol recurring across multiple maps. It looked like a jagged star, drawn in black ink, sometimes half-faded, other times bold and fresh. I couldn't figure out what it meant. Was it a warning? A destination? A danger? My fingers hovered uncertainly over the paper, the weight of the mystery pressing down on me. Suddenly, a shadow fell over the table. I froze, heart pounding. My uncle stood there, his eyes dark and unreadable, the light catching the dirt still clinging to the cuffs of his worn jacket. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, "You shouldn't be looking at those." I wanted to ask why, to demand answers, but something in his gaze stopped me. It was the same haunted look from before, the look of a man who'd seen something no one else should. He reached out and gently pushed the maps off the table, covering them like a protective mother shielding her child from harm. "I'm sorry," I whispered, but he just shook his head, the tension in his shoulders easing as if the weight lifted slightly, but only for a moment. When he left the room, I risked one last glance at the maps before closing the door behind me. My eyes landed on one particular map pinned to the corkboard, a sprawling forest with several red circles and that jagged star symbol. Near the bottom corner was a fresh mark, still vivid and wet-looking, as if drawn just hours ago. It was the same symbol I'd seen before but sharper, more urgent. The mark was new, made the very night he returned, covered in dirt. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I could feel, deep in my bones, that whatever it was far from over. The sharp knock echoed through the quiet morning, cutting through the usual calm like a blade. I was still half dreaming when Mom opened the door, and I caught the serious expressions of two detectives standing there, their dark suits crisp, faces unreadable but undeniably tense. One held a thick folder under his arm, the edges worn but neat, like it had been carried around for a long time, heavy with information we didn't yet understand. "What's going on?" my mother asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she glanced back at me and then to Dad, who had just come into the hallway. The confusion was mirrored in our eyes. Nothing like this had ever happened here. My uncle, who had been sitting quietly by the window, stiffened the moment the detective stepped inside. His usual calm gave way to something tight and wary, his eyes flicking quickly between the officers. I had never seen him look so unsettled. He cleared his throat, as if trying to steady himself, but the tension was thick enough to feel. The taller detective, his voice low but firm, spoke first. "We need to talk about your evening walks, Mr. Harris." My uncle's jaw clenched. "What about them?" "We understand you've been taking long walks through the nearby woods and other areas. Can you tell us more about where exactly you've been going? The detective opened the folder, flipping to a page with photographs and notes. We know you usually return after dark. Why is that? My uncle hesitated, glancing toward my parents and me as if searching for an escape. I like the solitude, the quiet. It helps me think. The other detective stepped forward, his tone more pressing. Solitude is one thing, sir, but the places you visited, some of them are remote, and some have been the focus of recent investigations. We need to understand your movements. Mom's eyebrows knit together in worry. Is this about something dangerous? Has anyone been hurt? The detectives exchanged a quick look but said nothing. Instead, the first officer gestured toward the folder again. We've been piecing together a timeline, matching sightings and reports with your walks. We need your cooperation. My uncle's eyes darkened, but he nodded slowly. I'll help however I can. The room felt colder somehow, the weight of the folder resting between us like a barrier. I could barely breathe as the detectives continued, their voices measured and serious, each question landing like a stone in the still air. Then, after a moment, the taller detective closed the folder with a definitive snap. There's something we need to show all of you. Something that might explain why we're here. My heart pounded as he motioned toward the door. We'd like you to come with us. It's important. My uncle's eyes locked onto mine for a brief second, an unspoken warning or perhaps a plea, before he stood and followed the officers out the door. We didn't hesitate. Whatever was waiting for us beyond that threshold, it was clear that nothing in our lives would be the same after this morning. The narrow path wound ahead, barely wider than a single footstep, flanked on either side by thick underbrush that scratched at my jeans and tugged at my sleeves. The cold air bit into my cheeks and seeped past the thin jacket I'd hastily thrown on, making my breath visible in soft white puffs that hung momentarily in the stillness. The trees arched overhead, their skeletal branches twisting against the gray sky like veins, casting a dim, muted light that made the forest feel both alive and secretive. Even though I had never stepped foot on this trail before, every twist and turn felt strangely familiar, like an echo from a dream or a half-remembered story told long ago. It was as if the forest itself recognized me, or perhaps I recognized it. The detectives moved with practiced ease, their footsteps purposeful but measured so as not to disturb the fragile silence. I kept close, my eyes darting over the leaf-strewn ground, scanning for anything out of place. The distance from the house quickly grew. What had once been the comforting shape of the porch and the flicker of windows now shrank behind us, swallowed by the dense tangle of trees and shadows. It was as if we were stepping deeper into another world, one stitched together by the quiet mysteries of soil and bark. One detective, tall with a worn leather jacket, paused, raising a gloved hand to halt the group. Here, he said softly, voice barely above a whisper. We gathered around him, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot fading into silence. Before us lay a hidden clearing, almost concealed by the surrounding thicket, a small patch of earth where the trees gave way to open sky. The space was eerily still, the cold air heavier here, as if the forest were holding its breath. I scanned the ground, and my heart skipped. Scattered across the clearing were multiple patches where the soil had been freshly disturbed, uneven mounds and indentations breaking the natural surface like tiny scars. I knelt down, brushing the loose dirt with my fingers, feeling the cool dampness beneath the dry leaves. There was something deliberate about the pattern. I glanced up at the detective who'd stopped us, then back at the ground. My uncle's maps flashed in my mind, the faded parchment covered in strange symbols and markings, lines and dots arranged with precision. The arrangement before me mirrored it exactly. Each patch of turned earth corresponded perfectly to the markings I'd traced countless times earlier, as if the map had come alive and etched itself into the forest floor. A chill ran down my spine, sharper than the cold air. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was a message, something hidden in plain sight, waiting to be uncovered. The detectives exchanged looks, their expressions unreadable in the low light, but I saw the flicker of recognition in their eyes. We were standing on the threshold of something much bigger, something tangled with secrets my uncle had guarded fiercely. And then, as the wind shifted through the branches, I caught the faintest sound, a barely audible scrape, like something moving just beyond the tree line, something deliberate and watchful. My pulse quickened. Whatever lay ahead was no longer just a mystery on paper. It was alive, and it was watching us. Detective Marlowe unfolded one of the uncle's worn maps on the hood of their car, the edges frayed from years tucked away in drawers and trunks. Look closely, she said, pointing to a series of symbols scattered across the hand-drawn grid. These aren't random doodles or artistic flourishes. They correspond exactly to features in the woods behind us. Her finger traced a crooked line that ran through tiny triangles, circles, and cryptic annotations. See these markings? The triangles represent tree clusters, the circles are clearings, and these numbers here. She tapped on a sequence of digits written in neat, almost obsessively precise handwriting. Those are distances, measured in paces. I leaned in, squinting. The map felt ancient, but the details were strikingly deliberate. So you're saying these aren't just hobby maps, like I thought. They're records. Detective Hayes nodded, pulling out a printed aerial photo of the forest area. Exactly. We overlaid your uncle's maps onto satellite images and GPS data. The alignments are precise, down to within a few feet. The distances between the markings correspond with actual clearings and landmarks out here, some of which we didn't even know existed until now. He pointed to a cluster of trees a few hundred yards away. For example, this clearing here matches the circle marked C3 on the map, exactly 420 paces from the base point your uncle marked as home. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of it all. And the dates? I saw notes in the margins, dates, sometimes month and day, sometimes just years. Marlowe flipped to another page, this one covered in dense scribbles and symbols. Those dates are crucial. They track when your uncle was here, or when he documented visits. For instance, this page shows entries from 98 through 04, each one marked with a small symbol beside the date. We cross-checked those against missing persons reports and witness statements. There's a disturbing overlap. My heart hammered. You mean he wasn't just mapping the woods? He was tracking something, or someone. Hayes exchanged a glance with Marlowe, then lowered his voice. We believe these maps were a ledger, keeping record of people he led into the woods. Each date corresponds to a trip, and the symbols mark where he took them. I stared at the faded ink as if it might suddenly reveal more, names, faces, reasons. The realization crashed over me. My uncle's lifelong obsession wasn't some eccentric pastime. It was a meticulous, chilling documentation of his movements and encounters. Marlowe's voice cut through the silence. What's even more unsettling is that we found reports from hikers and locals who saw him guiding groups through these very woods. Some described him as a charismatic figure, leading people on adventures or spiritual journeys. But no one knew where they were headed, and many never came back. The wind rustled the leaves, the woods pressing in around us like a living thing. I glanced toward the tree line, suddenly unsure if I wanted to see what was lurking beyond. He was leading people here, I whispered. But why? And where? Hayes looked grave. That's what we need to find out. And soon. Because if those maps are accurate, we're standing on the edge of something far darker, and far closer, than any of us imagined. A sudden snap echoed from deeper in the forest. All three of us froze, eyes darting to the shadows between the trunks. The detectives exchanged a tense look, and I knew the past wasn't done revealing its secrets. Not yet. For years, I'd noticed the small oddities in my uncle's routine, little things that never quite fit together. He was a man of habit, but his habits always had a strange edge. I remember the way he would slip out of the house just as the clock struck midnight, the faint sound of the back door clicking shut behind him. No matter how quietly I tried to follow, he was always gone before I could get close. Those late-night departures weren't new, but now, looking back, they carried a weight I hadn't understood before. There were the objects, too. Things he carried that never seemed to match his quiet, practical demeanor. A worn leather satchel, always zipped tight, heavy but mysterious. Sometimes I caught glimpses of it when he moved, the glint of metal through the worn fabric, the occasional thud when he set it down by the door. I'd ask him once or twice about what was inside, but he'd brush me off, eyes narrowing just enough to make me back away. When someone else dared question him about those strange items, he would stiffen, voice low and clipped, as if guarding a secret too dangerous to share. I remember one afternoon when Aunt Sarah, curious and a little concerned, asked him directly, "Why do you keep disappearing at night? And what's in that bag you carry around?" His reaction was almost immediate, a flash of irritation, then a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's none of your business," he said sharply, and the conversation ended there. The tension in the room lingered, thick and uncomfortable, like a storm waiting to break. It was unlike him to be so defensive. He was usually patient and calm, but this was something else entirely. Over the years, those moments piled up in my memory, unexplained and unsettling. I tried to dismiss them as quirks, maybe the relics of a past I didn't understand. But now, standing here with the detectives and the map spread before us, every fragment of those strange behaviors clicked into place. The late-night walks weren't aimless or whimsical, they were purposeful. The satchel didn't just hold tools or odds and ends, it held pieces of a life we never knew existed, a life my uncle had buried deep beneath the surface of our family's everyday normalcy. And then there were the disturbed patches of earth, small mounds in the forest near the edge of the property that no one had paid much attention to before. I had always thought they were just spots where the soil had shifted naturally, or maybe places where the previous owners had discarded debris. But now, with the detectives digging through the dirt, the truth was starting to surface. When they mentioned finding items buried beneath one of those areas, my heart stopped. What could be hidden there? Maps? Artifacts? Or something darker? The weight of my uncle's silence, the secrets he carried, pressed down on me like a heavy fog. The question wasn't just what he was hiding anymore, it was what that hidden life meant for all of us. And more than anything, what was still waiting to be uncovered in the shadows he left behind. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the faint scrape of metal against earth. Each strike of the shovel sent a small cloud of dust swirling upward, catching the fading light like tiny restless ghosts. I stood close, my breath shallow, heart pounding in a rhythm that felt both foreign and expected. Time seemed to stretch, every second heavy with the weight of what might be unearthed. The detectives exchanged glances, brief, sharp, and I could see the tension tightening their shoulders, the way their eyes darted between the disturbed soil and the horizon beyond. For a moment, I closed my eyes, trying to steady the storm inside me. My uncle's stories played back in my mind, not as distant memories but as something raw and urgent. Stories I had once dismissed as odd, exaggerated, or just the ramblings of a troubled past. Now they felt like confessions whispered in the dark, shadows reaching out from the corners of a room I thought I knew. The line between myth and truth blurred, and suddenly the man I thought I understood became a stranger whose silence screamed volumes. The shovel struck something harder beneath the earth. A sharp, hollow sound that cut through the quiet like a sudden crack in glass. The detectives froze, exchanging a glance that needed no words. My stomach twisted. The moment had arrived. Whatever lay beneath that soil was no longer a mystery, but a truth clawing its way up from the depths. As they carefully cleared the dirt, the shapes began to emerge. I kept my gaze fixed on their faces rather than the objects, trying to catch any flicker of shock, disbelief, or relief. Instead, there was a practiced calm, a solemn gravity that settled over the group like a shroud. Yet beneath the surface, I could feel the invisible tremor running through us all. It wasn't just what we had found, it was what it meant, the echo of my uncle's hidden life finally breaking free. A chill ran down my spine, and I swallowed hard, the pieces falling into place with a clarity that was both terrifying and undeniable. His stories weren't fabrications or eccentric tales told to pass the time. They were admissions, veiled in metaphor and silence, that spoke of things too heavy to say aloud. The man I had loved, the uncle who had shaped part of my childhood, had been carrying a secret so dark it had been buried beneath the soil, both literally and figuratively. I wanted to ask the detectives what this meant for us, for the family, for the man who was no longer just a memory but a puzzle with sharp edges. But the words stuck in my throat, tangled with fear and disbelief. Instead, I just stood there, watching the ground reveal its secrets one slow, deliberate inch at a time. Even as the pieces came into view, a gnawing question refused to fade, the one that haunted every whispered conversation and every careful glance. Was he truly alone in this? Or had someone else been there, standing beside him in the shadows, sharing the burden of those dark deeds? The answer wasn't clear, and the uncertainty clung to me like a second skin. I looked around at the detectives again, searching for any sign, any hint of what lay beyond this discovery. But in their eyes, I saw only the beginning of a deeper story, one that had yet to unfold. And in that moment, I realized that the truth, as heavy and painful as it was only the first step into a labyrinth I wasn't sure I was ready to navigate. Thank you for staying with me through this story. What we uncovered here is just one layer of a much larger, more complex picture. Cases like this don't end neatly, they continue to affect lives long after the immediate facts come to light. It's important to remember that behind every detail and every piece of evidence, there are real people people whose experiences don't simply conclude when the story does. I'm grateful you took the time to listen and reflect on what this case reveals about human behavior, trauma, and the challenges faced by those involved. These stories can be difficult to process, but they also remind us why it's necessary to approach these situations with care, patience, and a commitment to understanding the deeper truths. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories that delve into the psychological and emotional realities behind true crime, please subscribe to Under the Same Roof. Our goal is to share these accounts responsibly, focusing on the human side of every case, and providing insight that goes beyond the headlines. Before you go, I'd appreciate it if you could leave a comment saying, "I'm still watching." It helps me know that this message reaches you fully and that you're here to engage with the content thoughtfully. Your presence and feedback mean a lot and encourage me to continue bringing these stories to light with honesty and respect. Again, thank you for being part of this journey. I look forward to sharing more with you soon.